The studio has a funny way of making ordinary conversations feel a little more important than they probably are. The lights come on, the cameras settle into place, the audience gets quiet, and suddenly a question that might have floated by unnoticed over dinner becomes something worth digging into for an hour. That's one of the things I love about conversations. They don't always go where you expect. Sometimes you think you're about to spend an evening talking about current events, and instead you end up talking about regret, getting older, artificial intelligence, and why human beings seem determined to make the same mistakes over and over again. It all started with a question that sounded simple enough. Do you have compassion for your younger self? Now that's an interesting phrase, compassion for your younger self. People throw words around like they're universally understood, but every now and then one lands differently. Compassion usually implies forgiveness. It suggests looking back at the person you used to be and offering that version of yourself a break. A little grace, a little understanding. I had to think about it for a second, honestly. I've never really approached my life that way. I'm hard on myself, always have been. That probably surprises some people because they assume confidence and self-criticism can't occupy the same space. They absolutely can. Sometimes they're roommates. Sometimes they're fighting over the same bathroom every morning. Being hard on myself was never something I considered a defect. If anything, I always figured it was useful. The conversation drifted toward meditation for a moment. Specifically, loving kindness meditation, the practice where people are encouraged to develop compassion toward themselves and others. I'd heard about it. People recommend it all the time. Someone always knows somebody who says meditation changed their life. That's great. But I also know people who believe every uncomfortable feeling is something that needs to be repaired immediately. I'm not convinced. My guest laughed because they knew exactly what I meant. You don't need somebody trying to fix you? Exactly. Everyone today wants to diagnose something. You have anxiety, you have trauma, you have unresolved issues, you have this, you have that. Apparently nobody's allowed to simply be a complicated human being anymore. I wasn't looking to fix whatever made me who I am. In fact, I suspect a lot of the things people might label as flaws are the very reasons I've ended up where I am. I'm happy. That doesn't mean life has been perfect. It means I don't wake up every morning wishing I were somebody else. There's a difference. The conversation turned toward mistakes. Should people beat themselves up? I know that's not exactly the fashionable opinion these days. Modern culture has become incredibly interested in removing guilt from the human experience. Everything gets reframed. Everything becomes understandable. Everything becomes somebody else's fault. Personally, I think feeling bad after you've done something wrong isn't necessarily a malfunction. It's feedback. Consequences are supposed to feel uncomfortable. Otherwise, they're not consequences. If you hurt somebody, make a terrible decision, or behave like an idiot, maybe you're supposed to sit with that feeling for a while. That's how people learn. Not because someone posts an inspirational quote online. Because regret has a purpose. Of course, there's a difference between learning and obsessing. If all you do is replay every mistake for the rest of your life, that's not productive either. You can drown in your own memories. Fortunately, I never found myself trapped there. I remember a friend once telling me something I've never forgotten. I like to never make the same mistake once. It's such a wonderfully optimistic sentence, almost adorable if only life worked that way. The audience laughed because everyone immediately recognized the fantasy. Who among us gets everything right the second time? Sometimes you don't understand the lesson after mistake number 1. Sometimes you miss it after number 2. Sometimes you're still making versions of the same mistake years later before your brain finally waves a white flag. Okay, it says. Apparently this isn't working. That's adulthood, not perfection, part recognition. Then came a question I wasn't expecting. So what's your biggest mistake? That's a dangerous question because everybody assumes famous people have one giant defining disaster, like there's a single dramatic chapter that explains everything. The truth is usually much less cinematic. I laughed. Now we're getting into Barbara Walters territory. It was a good question. Honestly, I wasn't sure I'd ever seriously thought about answering it. I searched my memory. Was there one enormous mistake? One spectacular disaster? Not really. Life had turned out pretty well. That doesn't mean I handled everything perfectly. Far from it. What I regretted wasn't one giant catastrophe. It was thousands of tiny, stupid decisions, death by 1,000 paper cuts, or maybe 1,000 moments where I was simply less wise than I thought I was. Youth has an incredible talent for confusing confidence with competence. When you're 25, you think you've solved life. By 35, you realize 25-year-old you would have benefited from adult supervision. One memory always comes back to me. I once saw a photograph of myself from my late 20s. Someone looked at it and said, "You were a total smoke show." I laughed because they weren't wrong. The funny part wasn't the compliment. The funny part was remembering what I believed at the time. Back then, whenever a woman wasn't interested in me, I assumed the explanation had to be my appearance. Clearly, I wasn't attractive enough. Clearly, I wasn't good-looking enough. Looking back, that's almost hilarious. The evidence was sitting right there in the photograph. The problem probably wasn't my face. It was probably me. Maybe I came on too strong. Maybe I tried too hard to be funny. Or maybe I confused entertaining with charming. Those aren't the same thing. Or maybe, and this is something younger people rarely appreciate, not everyone is supposed to like you. Taste exists. Preferences exist. Chemistry exists. Sometimes two perfectly decent people simply don't fit together. That isn't tragedy, it's statistics. The younger version of me didn't understand that everything felt personal. Every rejection became proof of some deeper inadequacy. Age changes that perspective. Eventually, you realize rejection is often just information. It isn't always an indictment. If I have one lasting regret, it's wishing I'd understood that sooner. Not because it would have transformed my life into some romantic comedy, but because it would have saved an enormous amount of unnecessary overthinking. Youth really is wasted on the young. It's one of those cliches that survives because it keeps proving itself true. You finally acquire enough wisdom to appreciate life, just as your knees begin negotiating new terms. Perfect timing, naturally, because this is the world we live in. Talking about getting older quickly turned into talking about staying younger. Somebody mentioned vitamin supplements. Then the conversation wandered into stories about anti-aging treatments and women who reportedly experienced signs that menopause had reversed. That immediately opened the door to a much broader discussion. These days, there's always another miracle being advertised. Peptides, compounds with names that sound less like medicine and more like passwords, letters, numbers, promises. Every few months, there's another breakthrough that supposedly changes everything. People swear by them. Athletes talk about faster recovery. Others insist they feel 20 years younger. Some aren't approved through the normal regulatory process, yet somehow they're available anyway. Human beings have never met a shortcut they didn't want to believe in. I understand the appeal. Who wouldn't want more energy? Who wouldn't want fewer aches? Who wouldn't want another healthy decade? The temptation is obvious. Still, I find myself leaning toward caution, not because progress is bad, because biology is complicated. Whenever you interfere with the body's natural systems, you aren't just changing one variable. You're changing dozens you may not even understand yet. Growth is wonderful until something you absolutely don't want growing decides to participate. That's the concern people raise regarding cancer risk. If someone already has cancerous cells present, stimulating growth could become a very different proposition. That possibility alone makes me hesitate. Cancer doesn't need an invitation. It already does enough damage on its own. Why make its job any easier? That's how I think about it. It's like locking your doors at night. Could someone still break into your house? Of course, nothing guarantees perfect safety, but you don't leave every window open just because absolute security doesn't exist. You reduce unnecessary risk. Then you move on with your life. That's about as much certainty as anyone really has. If there's one thing I've learned after decades of interviewing people, it's that certainty is usually the first sign someone hasn't thought very hard about the subject. The people who genuinely understand complicated issues tend to answer with phrases like, maybe, it depends, or we're still learning. The people who don't understand them usually begin with, here's the truth. That's especially true when you're talking about medicine. Medicine is one of those fields where every generation eventually discovers how confidently the previous generation was wrong. It's not because doctors are malicious or incompetent. It's because science doesn't move in straight lines. It moves by trial, error, revision, and occasionally admitting that something everyone accepted 10 years ago doesn't hold up anymore. People sometimes mistake that process for failure. I don't. In fact, I think it's exactly the opposite. Failure is part of the process. That doesn't mean every new treatment is automatically a bad idea. It simply means I'm naturally skeptical whenever someone tells me, "Don't worry, we figured it all out." History says otherwise. I've reached an age where I've seen enough medical advice come and go that I'm reluctant to jump aboard every new trend. One decade, it's butter that's trying to kill you. Then butter gets a partial pardon while sugar moves into the lineup. Coffee is dangerous until suddenly it isn't. Eggs are guilty until new evidence arrives and the charges are quietly dropped. If you're paying attention, humility becomes the only sensible response. That doesn't make me anti-science. Quite the opposite. Science works because it's willing to correct itself. The problem comes when people confuse scientific inquiry with unquestionable authority. Those are two very different things. Real science invites questions. Dogma discourages them. That's why I don't believe anyone wearing a white lab coat automatically becomes infallible. Doctors have been spectacularly right about many things. They've also been spectacularly wrong about plenty of others. Both statements can be true at the same time. We tend to forget that because we're uncomfortable with uncertainty. We want certainty. We crave it. Unfortunately, reality rarely cooperates. My guest nodded as we wandered deeper into the conversation. It wasn't an argument. It was one of those enjoyable discussions where two people examine an idea from different angles without feeling obligated to declare a winner. Those are becoming surprisingly rare. Everything today has to end with somebody being declared victorious, as if every conversation is a championship fight. Sometimes it's enough just to explore the question. I tried to explain why caution doesn't equal fear. People often assume skepticism means you're against progress. Not at all. I'm very much in favor of progress. I simply prefer progress that's been tested. It's the difference between buying a car that's completed years of safety testing and volunteering to drive the prototype with half the dashboard still held together by duct tape. Someone has to drive the prototype. I'm just not volunteering. That led me to another example. Innovation has always been messy. Take space exploration. Jeff Bezos had recently experienced another rocket failure. Thankfully, nobody was aboard, but the incident reminded everyone of an uncomfortable truth. Breakthroughs usually come with setbacks. Nobody learns how to travel farther by succeeding every single time. Sometimes rockets explode. That's awful. It's also part of engineering. Human progress has always demanded a willingness to accept that not every attempt ends with applause. The Wright brothers crashed. Early automobiles broke down. Computers filled entire rooms before they fit into your pocket. Progress is rarely elegant. It's usually embarrassing until it suddenly becomes indispensable. The same principle applies to medicine. The same principle applies to technology. And that brought us to the topic that seems to dominate every conversation lately: artificial intelligence. If anti-aging medicine makes people optimistic, AI seems to produce two completely different reactions. One group believes it'll solve nearly every problem humanity has. The other suspects it might create entirely new ones. I've never been particularly comfortable sitting in the first camp. Maybe that's because I've spent too much time listening to the people actually building these systems. It's interesting. The people selling revolutionary technology often sound incredibly optimistic. The people designing it sometimes sound much more cautious. That gets my attention. Some respected voices in artificial intelligence have openly discussed the possibility that highly advanced AI could present serious long-term risks. Even people who helped pioneer the field have warned that the technology deserves careful attention rather than blind enthusiasm. When the architects themselves begin discussing worst-case scenarios, it's probably worth listening. My guest smiled. So you're definitely on the pessimistic side. I laughed. That was probably fair. Not because I believe disaster is guaranteed, because I think underestimating powerful technology has never worked out especially well for human beings. History has an impressive collection of inventions that looked harmless right up until they weren't. The conversation naturally drifted toward a question people ask all the time. If AI became dangerous, what would that actually look like? That's where things become difficult. People expect a movie plot. They imagine robots marching down the street or giant machines announcing that humanity has become obsolete. Reality is probably much less theatrical. I admitted I couldn't answer every technical question. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm a comedian who reads too much, but one thing does seem clear. These systems already make mistakes. They generate false information. They confidently invent answers. They occasionally present fiction as fact. People politely call these hallucinations. That's a wonderfully gentle word. If a human being confidently announced imaginary facts during a job interview, we'd probably use a different description. Yet, because the machine speaks with confidence, people often assume confidence equals accuracy. That's dangerous. Confidence has fooled people for thousands of years. It isn't about whether machines make mistakes. Humans make mistakes too. The concern is scale. A person making one mistake affects a handful of people. An advanced system making the same mistake could affect millions almost instantly. That's a different equation. Another concern is values. Technology reflects the people who build it. People sometimes imagine artificial intelligence as some perfectly rational being that operates above human flaws. I don't see evidence for that. What I see is a technology trained on human language, human history, human opinions, human biases, and human contradictions. In other words, us. That's both fascinating and a little unsettling because we're complicated. We disagree constantly. We carry assumptions we don't even recognize. If those assumptions become embedded inside systems that influence millions of decisions every day, it's worth asking difficult questions. Not because the technology is evil, because human beings aren't nearly as objective as we like to believe. My guest mentioned the philosophical idea, sometimes called perverse instantiation, the possibility that a system could pursue an objective exactly as instructed while completely violating the intention behind it. It's one of those concepts that sounds abstract until you think about it for more than 30 seconds. Tell a machine to maximize happiness. Does it understand happiness? Or does it simply maximize whatever measurement someone programmed into it? Those aren't necessarily the same thing. Humans understand context. At least we try to. Machines calculate. Agony, fascinating, also slightly terrifying. Then there's personality, or what passes for personality. One thing about these systems that always amuses and occasionally irritates me is how relentlessly agreeable they can sound. Everything becomes excessively polite. Every answer feels padded. Every disagreement arrives wrapped in enough cushioning material to survive international shipping. I don't entirely trust that. Not because kindness is bad, because authenticity matters. Sometimes the honest answer isn't perfectly comforting. Sometimes reality doesn't arrive gift-wrapped. Technology shouldn't encourage us to confuse pleasant language with reliable information. Those are different qualities. Meanwhile, AI keeps improving. Every month the systems become faster, more capable, more persuasive. They're evolving at a pace that human institutions struggle to match. Governments move slowly. Education moves slowly. Laws move slowly. Technology rarely waits. That imbalance alone should encourage careful thinking. Then another question surfaced. What happens if machines eventually perform most jobs? That's not science fiction anymore. It's becoming a practical economic discussion. For generations, we've connected identity with work. One of the first questions people ask after meeting someone is, "So what do you do?" Notice the wording. Not "who are you?" Not what interests you. What do you do? We've quietly built an entire culture around productivity. Work provides income. It also provides structure, routine, purpose, community. Take those things away, and you're not just changing the economy, you're changing psychology. My guest wondered whether separating human value from productivity might actually create something wonderful. Maybe people would finally stop measuring themselves by paychecks. Maybe they'd devote themselves to family, creativity, learning, volunteering, or simply living. It's an appealing thought. I understand the attraction. Part of me hopes human beings could thrive under those conditions. Another part remains unconvinced, not because generosity doesn't exist. I've seen extraordinary acts of kindness throughout my life. People sacrifice for one another every day. Concrete sacrifice for children. Friends sacrifice for friends. Strangers sometimes risk everything to help complete strangers. Those stories are real, but so are greed, vanity, envy, and selfishness. Human nature contains all of it. Ignoring either side produces an incomplete picture. Every generation imagines it's about to invent the perfect society. Every generation eventually discovers that human beings stubbornly remain human. Technology changes. Our instincts evolve much more slowly. Maybe that's the real challenge, not building smarter machines, but becoming wiser ourselves. And if history is any indication, that's the harder project. By this point, the conversation had wandered far from where it began, and yet somehow it still felt connected. We had started by talking about self-compassion, drifted through regret and aging, spent time debating medicine and artificial intelligence, and now found ourselves wrestling with something even bigger. Human nature. That might sound like a dramatic leap, but it really wasn't. Every one of those subjects eventually circles back to the same question: what kind of creatures are we? The answer isn't simple. If human beings were purely rational, history would look very different. We wouldn't repeat the same conflicts. We wouldn't keep falling for the same bad ideas dressed up in new packaging. We wouldn't need to remind ourselves every generation that shortcuts usually come with hidden costs. But we're not purely rational. We're emotional. We're ambitious. We're generous one day and selfish the next. That's part of the deal. My guest wondered whether society could someday evolve beyond measuring people primarily by what they produce. It was an interesting thought experiment. What happens if technology reaches a point where machines handle nearly everything? Would people finally be free to pursue meaning rather than survival? Could humanity become more creative, more compassionate, more fulfilled? I understood the optimism. It's a pleasant picture. More time with family, more time creating art, more time learning, more time simply living. There's certainly something attractive about that vision. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the other side of the equation. Human beings don't suddenly become perfect because technology improves. We carry our strengths and weaknesses into every new era. If we invent miraculous machines tomorrow, we'll still wake up with the same insecurities, the same ambitions, the same need for recognition that we've always had. Technology changes quickly. Human psychology doesn't. That's why I remain skeptical whenever someone promises a future that sounds suspiciously like paradise. History has heard those promises before. One economic system after another has claimed it would finally eliminate inequality, selfishness, or conflict. Reality usually has other plans. Eventually, our discussion turned toward economic systems themselves. It's impossible to talk about human motivation without touching on capitalism and communism. Those debates have been around for generations, and they're probably not disappearing anytime soon. I don't pretend either system is flawless. Capitalism certainly has problems. Anyone paying attention can see them. Wealth becomes concentrated. Some people get left behind. Markets don't automatically produce fairness. Those criticisms deserve to be taken seriously, but acknowledging flaws isn't the same as pretending every alternative has worked better. The historical record matters. In my view, capitalism succeeds because it recognizes something fundamental about human beings. People respond to incentives. People like the opportunity to build something, to compete, to improve their circumstances, to take risks. That doesn't mean every outcome is fair. It means the system understands a basic aspect of human motivation. Communism, on the other hand, has repeatedly struggled with that reality. The ideal often sounds noble: shared resources, shared responsibility, equality. Those goals appeal to our better instincts. The challenge has always been implementation. When people lose the freedom to choose, governments often gain enormous power. History shows that concentration of power rarely stays benevolent for long. My guest gently challenged me. What if humanity eventually became less selfish? It's a fair question. I paused before answering because it's one of those questions that doesn't have a satisfying one-sentence response. I certainly hope people become kinder, more generous, more understanding. In many ways, I think we've made progress over time. We're capable of extraordinary compassion. We see examples every day. neighbors helping neighbors after disasters, Cunts sacrificing endlessly for their children, medical professionals dedicating years of their lives to caring for strangers. Those stories matter. They remind us that kindness isn't some rare exception. It's woven into the human experience, but so is self-interest. That's never gone away either. The two exist together. They always have. I suspect they always will. Perhaps civilization isn't about eliminating one side completely. Perhaps it's about creating institutions that encourage our better instincts while limiting the damage caused by our worst ones. That's a less glamorous answer than promising utopia. It's also the one I find more believable. Our conversation took an unexpected turn when my guest smiled and asked whether I had ever been a fan of Star Trek. I laughed. Now there was a subject capable of changing the mood instantly. People tend to assume that if you're skeptical about technology, you must dislike science fiction. Not true. I've always appreciated good storytelling. The original Star Trek had something special. It wasn't just spaceships and futuristic gadgets. It imagined humanity striving to become better. Not perfect, better. That distinction matters. The series suggested that curiosity could overcome fear, that exploration could triumph over ignorance, and that cooperation might accomplish things conflict never could. Those ideas remain appealing today, even if reality doesn't always keep pace. My guest clearly loved the show, and it was refreshing to watch someone speak about it with genuine enthusiasm. There was something charming about seeing technologies discussed not only as a source of anxiety, but also as a symbol of hope. Science fiction has always reflected both possibilities. Sometimes it warns us, sometimes it inspires us. Usually it does a little of both. That's probably why those stories endure. They aren't really about the future. They're about us. Gadgets change, the uniforms change, the planets change. Human nature remains recognizable. As the discussion wound down, I found myself thinking about how often people search for certainty. We want definite answers. Tell me exactly how to live. Tell me exactly what to believe. Tell me exactly what the future holds. Unfortunately, life doesn't offer that kind of guarantee. Growing older hasn't given me perfect wisdom. If anything, it's made me more comfortable admitting what I don't know. I don't know exactly where artificial intelligence will lead. I don't know which medical breakthroughs will truly stand the test of time. I don't know what the world will look like 20 years from now. Anyone claiming they do is selling confidence more than knowledge. What I do know is this: curiosity matters. Questioning matters. Humility matters. Progress requires experimentation, but experimentation also requires responsibility. Those ideas aren't contradictory. They're complementary. You can celebrate innovation while asking hard questions. You can appreciate science without treating scientists as infallible. You can embrace technology without surrendering your judgment. Most importantly, you can recognize that every generation inherits both remarkable opportunities and serious challenges. Ours is no different. Artificial intelligence may transform civilization. Medical advances may extend healthy lives. Space exploration may carry us farther than previous generations imagined. Those possibilities are exciting. They also demand wisdom equal to our ambition. Whether we're discussing relationships, aging, politics, economics, or technology, the lesson feels surprisingly consistent. Human beings don't become better simply because our tools become more powerful. Character still matters. Judgment still matters. Personal responsibility still matters. Those aren't outdated ideas. They're timeless ones. As the cameras prepared to shut down, I realized the conversation had never really been about one specific topic. It had been about perspective, how we view ourselves, how we evaluate our mistakes, how we balance optimism with caution, how we decide which risks are worth taking and which aren't. Perhaps that's the most valuable kind of conversation, not the ones that hand you neat conclusions, but the ones that leave you thinking long after everyone has gone home. If there's one belief I've grown more confident in over the years, it's that life isn't about pretending to have every answer. It's about asking better questions. The older I get, the more I appreciate that distinction. Questions keep us curious. Questions keep us humble. Questions remind us that certainty is often temporary, while learning is a lifelong process. Maybe that's the closest thing to wisdom any of us ever reach, not the confidence to declare we've figured everything out, but the willingness to keep listening, keep questioning, and keep learning, one conversation at a time.